Welcome to Thinking Deeply about Primary Education, the podcast that makes time and space to think about pedagogy, teaching and learning, professional development, anything of interest to time poor but enthusiasm rich primary teachers. And so this week we welcome back Adam Lowen to the podcast. Hi Adam, how are you?
Good afternoon. I'm well, Kieran. How are you?
Yeah, very good, thanks. It's been a long time since you and Sue were on talking about SEND. I mean, can you remember when it was?
Gosh, that must be 2.5 years ago, perhaps. Time flies. Time flies.
Does. Yeah, so we'll be talking 2022, 2023-ish, that ballpark. Ouch.
Hmm.
I mean, I think listeners really enjoyed your appearance, and then obviously one of the episodes we've had was actually the interview you did with Stuart. As part of our webinar, I use those because they're really rich conversations. But we're going to focus our attention on the writing framework, and in
Okay.
particular some of the discourse that's sort of been floating around since its publication at the start of July. I suppose the first question is: to what extent does the framework's focus on transcription and sentence level precision inadvertently deprioritize things like imaginative writing and open ended composition?
Absolutely. And I guess my stance really, Kieran, is not to advocate necessarily one way or the other, but just to give a candid reflection really on the writing framework. So from my point of view, I think like any piece of guidance, there are aspects as a school leader you want to take away in a simulator and think about how you implement to your setting. But also, it's not about wholesale adaptation without considering what it really means. So the writing framework is definitely very clear on the importance of those strong foundations for pupils and why it is hugely helpful for them in terms of the writing process to have that technical accuracy and sentence construction, but acting, I think, as a support, as a scaffold to creative writing. I don't think the two are mutually exclusive. And the writing framework talks about the fact that that technical accuracy serves as a form of oracy, which means that all pupils, particularly those who are most vulnerable, have a chance to have their voice heard when they're not in the room and to explain to the reader. That's a key part of the writing process there. So I do think the writing framework is technically accurately focused. It is transcription focused. It does talk about composition and it does talk about creativity being an aspect. But no, that the focus is more on the technical side. But I don't think the two are mutually exclusive. And I would argue that in terms of cognitive load, that helping children develop that fluency in those key skills actually allows them to be creative rather than necessarily hinders them.
And if we imagine, say for instance, you're your head teacher and you have got staff who are concerned about this,
Mm.
how would you approach sort of almost calming the storm, so to speak, because they may have built up over the summer holidays, I'm really worried about the direction we're going with this. What would your approach be to that sort of transition?
I suggest, Kieran, time and space and conversation and dialogue. So, very appreciative of how busy colleagues are and teachers. Some teachers will have read all 150 pages of the writing framework. Some will be working from the executive summary, and some will be understandably responding to the snippets they hear in headlines or on social media or the like. So, I'd be given a chance for, as a team, us to explore what it actually means, what it actually says. I'd be having those explicit conversations about reservations colleagues may have. And I'd also be giving freedom and space in terms of what does imagination and creativity and richness mean in our setting, because I think that's crucial as well. I think that without that stimulation, so be that, for example, rich model texts as something to anchor the learning into, I think the sentence work in isolation carries a bit of a health warning. It's not to say it can't be done, but if that's all we're doing, it becomes a very dull and dry and uninspiring diet for young people. So I think that is part of the dialogue. Part of the dialogue is about what the writing framework says, but also part of it's what it doesn't say. Then, as a team, working out how we're going to have a coherent approach to that to provide the best experiences for the pupils.
Things won't change overnight. We're not going back on Monday and the baby's out with the bathwater, is it really? So I mean, because when I look at it, I mean it sort of it feeds into a lot of my biases. I've never been a fan of genre based approaches. I've always felt like the the precision, probably since I met Chris the precision in English language is almost missing, and this sort of approaches that creating a balance where you've got the opportunity to be a really effective writer rather than just sort of off you go. I mean, that's probably an unfair characterization. I don't know. I mean, what does your sort of instinct tell you? Do you think this is the direction we should be traveling, or?
Well, I'd make an analogy almost like a pair of scales, that it's about balance, that precision and technical accuracy is vital, but so is the creativity and imagination and the motivation, enthusiasm, the love of writing. They need to be balanced, most definitely. But I would also agree that to be able to articulate your point in writing, that sentence needs to make sense to be read independently. Then that sentence then feeds into paragraphs, then the whole piece as well. So if pupils are not able to express themselves fluently without needing to explain to somebody else what the writing actually says, it then stifles their creative voice there as well. And I mean, you talk about biases, Kieran. What I would say about the writing framework, and one of the reasons why it does seem to me in large parts, it's nothing new. It reminds me of my grounding was very much in the days of the National Literacy Strategy and the new frameworks. And there's lots, it would seem, of the old messages and the common sense and the practicality around curriculum pedagogy that I remember from 15 years ago plus coming through again now there as well. And go back to my point about the scales, it is about finding balance. You can't have one thing without the other. Um, and I want to really stress that from my point of view, I would hate for pupils not to be inspired and motivated. The idea of worksheet after worksheet of dull grammatical work with no context sounds horrendous, frankly. But at the same time, without that framework, a coherence of progression based on technical accuracy, I'm not sure we're best supporting all pupils, and particularly those who are most vulnerable. In terms of social equity, the most advantaged are likely to be more successful in a process without that supportive scaffolds. I'd argue everybody can benefit from them, but it's particularly the most vulnerable pupils that need it the most.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, those are the pupils we're really here for, aren't we? I've seen Becky Allen talk about how, at a certain sort of financial sort of stability, it doesn't really matter what school you go to because you're going to be just fine. And so, those children you highlight are definitely the ones we should, certainly try to focus our attention on. You've sort of almost alluded to this next question a little bit. Is given repeated cautions within the framework, such as avoiding excessive test preparation, how effectively does the guidance balance assessment readiness with creative freedom in practice?
And I think that's quite a positive aspect. That it's very clear with the writing frame. The most important thing is the holistic development of pupils as writers. It's not preparing them for an endpoint assessment. Most definitely there. For colleagues who are at the end of a key stage, I'm thinking about key stage 2, then there are most definitely pressures linked to teacher assessment frameworks, and there can be a sense of jumping through hoops and trying to satisfy compliant criteria for individuals. Again, a bit like creativity, that's something important as a school to work out what that looks like in reality. And whilst the writing framework says that you shouldn't be focused on assessment preparation, there is a balance of reality again, that when it comes down to the end of the day, that outcomes play a huge part in a school and a young person's journey there as well. But I'm heartened that the framework encourages focusing on the authentic teaching and learning experience for youngsters rather than focusing on assessments. And ultimately, I go back to my first teaching position. I was in a school, I was a year 6 teacher, Kieran, who, in honesty, assessment prep to an inch of our lives youngsters for the SATs. I went to my second school, and the head teacher was really clear that was not going to happen there. That we were going to have a full, rich curriculum all the way through. And I was ready for this revolution because from the first experience, I already had my reservations. But actually, the second way was far, far better. The pupils enjoyed it more, the teachers enjoyed it more, and actually the outcomes are better at the second school rather than the first. So I'm glad the writing framework is steering more towards the full curriculum experience rather than preparing for assessments, most definitely.
Yeah, yeah. It's almost like it's the byproduct of a really high quality education experiences
Yes.
will be those outcomes at the end of the test. I mean, this feels like it's one lever that's been pulled. Do you reckon there are changes to the moderation process on the horizon, given that it feels like that also pushes schools in that direction? You know, the almost the characteristic version one that you have there. You know, the writing is assessed through a tick sheet, a checklist. You know, what do you reckon that's on the horizon? I mean, it may even mention it. I just missed it.
Well, the signposting in the writing framework is almost an interim document dependent on the curriculum assessment review. So I have no inside intelligence, Kieran, in terms of what the outcome of that may be. But I think it's a decent question to ask that if we're looking at what assessment looks like, then at the end of all key stages, including key stage two, that would that writing process need to modify and to change? So I guess let's watch the space. I think the curriculum assessment review is due October, the autumn term, I believe. But the writing framework does signpost towards changes are coming. What they may be or not, I'm not entirely placed to comment upon.
So that's quite nice and mysterious. So something to look forward to as the nights get darker. Another 150-page document to read through.
As always.
Some critics have warned that the framework's strong emphasis on the technical aspects risks robbing children of their motivation. I mean, you've alluded to this, and that it may reflect a pre-selected narrow interpretation of the research. How do you think this might affect people's creative identities and engagement as writers, if it is the case?
I don't think the writing framework is a utterly comprehensive document. I mean, you've just said it's 147 pages long as it is, and I think that some of the facets you're alluding to there do demand attention, exploration. But then you're looking at a 300-page document or 450-page document. So I think that system leaders have tried to focus on a key aspect. It ties into Ofsted review last autumn to do their strong foundations, and they had similar themes that in some schools perhaps we had lost that focus on technical accuracy um, with the ambition of creativity, but perhaps not giving young people those strong basics of linked to transcription and technical accuracy that's very necessary. And again, repeating myself, I'm not sure that the focus on the technical side necessarily comes at the cost of the creativity. Um, but like anything, if you take the framework as almost binary, so it's either if you view that writing is either technical or creative, and you therefore going to look just at the technical side, I think that's misplaced. And I almost go back to my first answer, Kieran. We're talking about I would encourage schools, teachers, leaders to look at the research base, look at the evidence linked to what creativity means, how they're going to enrich that process. The writing framework is light on that, but because it's light, I'm not sure that means that it's not important. It's just there's only so much you can cover in one document, possibly at one time.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, because like you mentioned the snippets on social media and stuff. You know, one of the things that I see quite a bit is the X-ray of the child's hand, and it's a bit of a research red flag because it totally ignores the complexity of sort of human formation and the things that are necessary in early years to support children in learning to write. You know, and the idea that your bones or your I don't know what are your physiology, would that be the right term? Or your anatomy are preventing you from learning to write. You know, it's a dangerous space because I don't, you know, if we're saying oh the research has been cherry picked in the report, but actually the research that's been used to counter isn't of a very high standard at all. You know, it worries me slightly that these conversations are going unchecked, and I'm certainly have no intention of getting online and fighting with people about their choice of research.
No, I'd agree as well. That's not how I would operate either there as well. Um, but certainly interesting. So in the work that I do and my colleagues do in different spaces, we visit lots of schools and we're privileged enough to speak to pupil voice regarding writing. And one of the things that we have noted as a team is collectively more and more young people are talking about actually writing hurting. actual handwriting process being something that they are finding extremely challenging. And um, without going into the aforementioned research you just linked to there as well, but I also wonder if we maybe it's worthwhile looking at the social context we operate within. So um, COVID still amazes me. It amazes me how little we talk about it now. I do get that we can't keep going back in time, but it was only 4 years ago that youngsters at clearly important parts of their development. So those who are in reception year one missed out experiences their counterparts would have experienced previously. Um, and like it or not, the reality is that handwriting is a key skill that we need to engage with throughout our time in schooling, and until the education system in this country completely reforms, takes handwriting away, which I think is going to be quite a long time. Um, it makes me smile that at secondary, you hear the phrase, "Well, people don't care about handwriting at secondary. Nobody's holding the young people to account what they're doing in terms of their notes." But actually, those notes do need to be fluent and they do need to be legible. So I would argue that it is still a vital skill to develop, research withstanding.
Yeah, and there's stuff about the connection between memory and handwriting. Because I know we use computers and phones and things a lot more nowadays. Because there are times when I've had to write by hand. Say a form has to be done by completely by hand for some reason, um, and it does hurt. Because it's been so long. But back in the day, we would have been writing what 8 hours a day in school, and you just almost like you forget that. But yeah, I think there's definitely a connection, and I absolutely agree with you. There are many reasons why we should learn to handwrite. I just think it just does almost like it's indicative of a broader. I don't know, because I mean, knowing Timothy Mills and leading the sort of the review and the writing of this paper, his work at Step, a lot of respect for it, a lot of respect for the sort of their engagement with us as a trust with education research. I've seen them firsthand how they reduce teacher workload but make teachers more effective through their engagement with research and the way they train their teachers and things. Even those papers that I haven't read in this, I would, he's one of, it's a group of people who I would be willing to trust with their interpretation of the research. So it's almost a question of how do we, as school leaders, support our teachers in going beyond the social media snippets.
Mm.
And like I said, we don't want to read the whole thing, maybe, and certainly not in one sitting. But does that, do you think it is worthwhile being a focus across a whole year, or do we break it up into smaller parts? I don't know. What would your thinking be on that?
It needs to tie into a wider piece of improvement. So it needs to tie into a focus. So if a school's looking to comply with the writing framework, I would utterly recommend that not to be the case. That's otherwise you are just moving into a tick box style process. But if it's a case of reviewing provision, reviewing curriculum, and particularly the intentionality behind the curriculum, then I would recommend that colleagues move past the social media headlines. Um, I mean, the good news is it's 147 pages long. Lots of that is actually citation and research. Lots of that is diagrams. So it's not 147 pages of complete text. But I'm not suggesting that the average classroom teacher reads the whole every single page. But for subject leads, most definitely taking aspects of this and unpacking and unpicking what it actually means, having those conversations is very worthy. Otherwise, like anything, Kieran, if you can reduce a piece of guidance to a social media post, a LinkedIn post or Blue Sky, whatever it might be, in terms of how reductionist that is, it's probably significant. And there is, I would say, the writing framework has got balance in there. It does allude sometimes to counterpoints that may be made. I'm not claiming it's a perfect piece of documentation. I'm not here to advocate saying that it is the way forward, but I think there are aspects of it that would engage some very worthy conversation in staff rooms and within teaching teams, and for leaders and teachers together to reflect about what this means for our settings and what we may take from it.
And what sort of approach do you take at leading English? Because you're sort of doing some work in this space. Is that the kind of support you guys provide for schools, or is there a certain model that you sort of adopted?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's so the key part is about meaningful implementation. So the work that we are doing effectively about putting frameworks in places around schools and helping put frameworks in place. And for those schools to understand what it means for their context. So every context is unique. Every setting is different. And what you don't want to move to a place is prescription, that teachers are doing things because they're told they have to. Otherwise, all that happens are quality assurance activities where you go around with a clipboard and you tick that in, is that there, rather than the impact it's having and what lies behind that as well. So the work we do with Leading English is helping schools to have those reflections and then those conversations as teams around then curriculum choices and pedagogy choices. I mean, what's heartening for us is, I mean, that body of work has been years in the making, but the writing framework very much affirms the approach that we are taking, which is that importance on the technical accuracy. But the work that we do is around model text and having rich, stimulating, provoking pieces written by renowned authors to give children that passion and love to write.
It's that balance you've been speaking about, then, really, isn't it?
Absolutely. I describe it as a relentless focus on technical accuracy and unapologetic as well. And I talk about the word relentless not in terms of that sounds like you're chasing record outcomes or Ofsted judgments. I don't mean that at all, but I mean every day having that focus. And social equity is a big driver of our work. I've talked about the most vulnerable. That's a key facet, and that vulnerability can be socioeconomic, it can be cognition, it can be attainment, it can be a whole raft of barriers as well. But for us, it's about giving children those skills to express themselves, but at the same time being inspired. They need to have a foster. They need to foster a love of literature and reading and writing. That's really, really important. Um, it needs to be authentic. They need to feel like there's real purpose. They're writing a real audience. You don't want to become transactional. You don't want them to just be writing because they're told they have to write in response to something. And therefore, teachers understanding that, because it is complex, is really important, Kieran. Making sure that teams have that awareness, schools have that awareness, what it actually means in reality is what we hope to achieve.
I've sort of set this conversation up as in terms of it is this dichotomy, but really, the short answer is it's as always a false dichotomy, and anything we can do to sort of give people the tools to thrive, but also the inspiration at the same time. I mean, that's ultimately the job, isn't it? Whether it's maths, English, or any of the other subjects, isn't it?
You want your teachers to thrive, you want your leaders to thrive, but most importantly, you want your pupils to thrive and therefore the communities to thrive as well. That's the key part. And as you just said there, Kieran, so much of life, so much of school improvement is about balance. It's not about one thing. Um, the writing framework is weighted towards the technical accuracy, most definitely. But I don't think it's saying you should exclude the creative aspect at all. It's just, without repeating myself, those system leaders are saying that if we're going to make one difference right now, what's going to make the biggest difference to most young people is just helping get that focus slightly more skewed that way.
Yeah. I mean, I remember whenever the spelling, punctuation, and grammar
Mm.
paper came in, there was a big upskilling job where we all had like the little Oxford pocketbook of grammar. We're learning about how you don't join underneath an apostrophe, because there were a lot of points lost in 2016. Do you reckon the teachers who've only existed in a post 2012 sort of version of the education system in England, they're well equipped with this grammatical knowledge because it's been baked in? Do you
Mm.
reckon, or is there an upskilling piece that needs to come alongside this over the next, maybe, let's say, 5 years or so?
I mean, part of the work we do with Leading English is one of the things we recognise is that subject knowledge for teachers in English and writing in particular can be very demanding. And I also think that if I talk about generations, if I can, but the generation who've been in teaching since that curriculum overhaul in primary, they will be entering the profession, if I was to generalise, having had more of a focus for initial teacher training, their early teaching experiences, focus on the grammatical error. However, in terms of subject knowledge, it's more than just the grammar aspect. The actual technical process of writing demands that colleagues do require a significant amount of time for CPD, and also understanding what CPD means. So, not only by CPD am I alluding to the staff meeting or the teacher teachers all together with leader at front style model. That can be a form of CPD, but really I'm picking exactly what CPD is and the amount of CPD that can take place in a school to help people have that understanding in their practice. Um, and a lot of that valuable work for me is around conversations. It's about pre-teaching conversations and post-teaching conversations, reflections in planning, reflections post-delivery, and helping teaching teams unpick what this terminology means and how that means they're going to implement it for that setting is a critical part. And I think it's a huge body of work now. And I think that within the system, we need to keep revisiting CPD for writing. And I think it's really important and can make a huge difference.
You mentioned the national strategies. There's a lot of investment in national sort of training that took place, wasn't there? And certainly, I think I caught the tail end of it because I think it was probably around 2000, 2003 that it first started. And I started 2008. I was sort of getting we still went out, but then very shortly afterwards, external training almost got knocked on the head permanently. So I can imagine because the more I think about the domain sort of complexity of English, what you're describing there is almost taking what we know about effective professional development and the things we've been learning, certainly that have been articulated over the last couple of years, and combining that with this sort of almost shift in direction, because I do think it's a shift in direction for a lot of schools to find the path of not least resistance, but the most fluid path. Where the water, the water finds its way through the mountain. Yeah,
Mm.
if you'll allow me a really clunky metaphor.
And the writing framework is clear about the role of the English subject lead. That it actually is fairly directive on that. That the English subject lead is the person who needs to have the responsibility and the authority to shape the curriculum from early years all the way through to Key Stage 2 to make sure it's a progressive journey. Now, in reality, that doesn't mean that one poor person has to hold that upon their shoulders, but it does mean that for a school to have that coherence and progression is really important. I think it's important in all curriculum areas. I think it's imperative, it's vital in English and within writing to help then have that framework that you are making sure you're learning sequential over time to make sure that year 4 builds on year 3, builds on year 2, and goes on, links to year 5 there. Because otherwise it is very easy for that to get lost. I can't quite come up with an analogy about the water finding its way and becoming a mess, but there's something in there that otherwise you end up repetition, a lack of progression, and a lack of sequencing there as well, which is why that relentless focus on the technical accuracy to me is very important in curriculum design. It's the work we do at Lead in English is helping schools map that out coherently, so you are moving young people forward. With one of the challenges I always think with writing, Kieran, is and maybe if I contrast it to maths, in most instances, if I give you a maths calculation, a young person, even myself, I can either do it or I can't. I can pragmatize, I can try and error, I can develop solutions in place, but it becomes at some point quite clear where I'm lacking the knowledge or there's an issue with application. In writing, if I was to ask most pupils, the vast majority of pupils in a primary school, even very young, to write me a narrative, they would do something. And that's the danger of writing. Writing is the doing can mask the learning and the progression. And because the vast majority of people can do and will do, it can get lost then what the real progressive journey in terms of that knowledge and skill and understanding is in writing. Hence why it's important that the leaders and teachers have that clarity in terms of what that is.
Where are you going to for your clarity whenever you're thinking about this journey for them? Is it the national curriculum and the grammatical sort of aspects of it, or do you connect a few things together?
So it is connecting a few things together. That's a really important point. So the national curriculum is the starting point. So you have the phases. So 5, 6, 3, 4, 2, 1 into early years. So that gives you that overview there. The assessment frameworks are a good place to look at for the end of key stage 1 and end of key stage 2 markers in there as well. It's also important to think about your high retaining pupils, or giving pupils sufficient stretch and challenge, so moving beyond the curriculum uh, as well there. And the other thing I'd also say is that in terms of a writing curriculum, we advocate for Reading English that actually it's not so much a writing curriculum, it's an English curriculum. Your English curriculum needs to have a combination of your writing, but also reading. And the key part here is the spoken language or the oracy. And one of the things, so again, I'm a product of my teacher youth, that back in my day, part of your English curriculum used to be speaking and listening lessons. And sometimes we find that in terms of oracy, oracy is left as a pedagogy approach, and that is part of oracy, but actually, oracy or spoken language as framed in the national curriculum is a discrete element in itself. So actually having lessons around those spoken language objectives are really valuable, because as the writing framework says, the national curriculum has said now for a long time that children being able to orally rehearse and construct what they want to write is a key step there as well. So in terms of curriculum design, it is not only the progression in the writing that's key, Kieran, it's how reading and then spoken language then all interweaves together is really, really important.
Yeah, because you'll often find that the reading comes first, doesn't it? Or certainly that seems to be reflected in the data. You know, people when they're when they're confident with the reading, then the writing sort of flows from it. So yeah, I mean, I think that makes total sense. I can see that relationship. I mean, where does the phonics come into it? I mean, is that because I mean at the minute it seems to be almost standalone for everybody. Is that like is that a long term solution, or do you think they'll become more integrated over time?
So my smile, I'm just as you're speaking, Kieran, makes me think about a conversation I was having right towards the end of last term before the summer about how there could be a real danger that we have created phonics as a discrete subject area that has no link then into English. And so phonics is a strategy. If we look at the simple view of reading, that supports reading, it also supports spelling and writing as well. It's a tool. Um, it's not the one and only tool, um, despite what our testing regime might suggest, but it's a tool, but it's a vital tool. And one of the conversations I was having in a school was it was quite clear that the phonics lead and the English lead were not connected. They weren't, they're very almost unaware of what each was doing and how the two linked together. And I can understand why. Very busy places, class teachers are having to carry additional leadership responsibility. But the challenge and reflection that we were doing in that setting was helping think, well, actually, how can you connect the two together? Otherwise, phonics is just phonics. It's not part of the whole of that reading journey.
Yeah, I mean, because we get things like phonics doesn't end at the end of year one, and and it could still be going on to year 3 and 4. And as I'm listening to you speak, I can see the benefits of having like something that's just completely rounded and connected, because then you don't miss any of those tricks that you're sort of outlining. And they're not tricks, but that's just the phrase missing. I don't want to miss a trick. But this really sensible approach to sort of the reading, the oracy, the writing, and the phonics ultimately feeding all of that. So maybe that is a future 5-10 years down the line where things start to refine and move forward. I mean, if anyone's interested in getting in touch and thinking actually this sounds really really good, where's the best place to reach you, Adam? I'm trying to celebrate the guests a bit more and make it easier to contact people, because at the minute they just have to hopefully find them on one of the many social media sites that we've all gone to since Twitter.
In terms of the work around English, I direct them towards the Leading English website, so www.leadingenglish.co.uk. That'll give you a flavour of who we are and what we're about. And if colleagues are so interested, you can book a chance to have a conversation with myself, one of my colleagues, and we will talk about what it is that we do and how we may be able to support. So obviously, free and no obligation at all. Treat it like a free consultation if you so wish. And then the work at Leading English is around curriculum documentation, high quality model text, but it's also about a year-long partnership. So school improvement support through the lens of English. So please do check us out and reach out if you're keen to have a conversation.
Nice one. I'm sure lots of people will. All I said to do is say thank you very much for joining me. It's been an absolute pleasure, Alan. Thank you.
Thank you for your time, Kieran. Much appreciated.
And everyone at home, until next time, thanks for listening.